Hello, Bible Geeks. Ryan Schumacher here. We are here with week 7 of the What Does God Know and When Did He Know It series on foreknowledge, evil, and suffering. If you've been with us from the beginning, you know that we've gone through multiple models of God's foreknowledge. And how does God know the future? And what are the different ideas behind how God does in fact, does God in fact have exhaustive, definite foreknowledge? And if so, how does that happen? We've started then in the subsequent weeks to get into some of the questions about the nature of the human will. And last week we walked through major church controversies or controversies in church history regarding how we were to understand the nature of the human will. And here I wanted to tackle it from a little bit more of a, call it a philosophical perspective, but the question of, is free will compatible with divine sovereignty? So, and maybe a better way to do this would be to call it, is free will compatible with divine foreknowledge? That's probably the stronger way to put it. So maybe I should fix that. And there it goes. You all know I'm a magician, right? Dang, I'm good. Okay, so we're going to get into the topic now. I also thought this cartoon was really quite funny. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to recap the problem of human freedom. Talk through why exactly this is a problem again, go back to kind of week 1 things. Then we're going to talk about 2 concepts, libertarian freedom and compatibilistic freedom. These are 2 different understandings of what it means when we use the words human freedom. And then we're going to end with, or we'll sort of intersperse throughout, I guess, and then end with, to what extent is God responsible for human evil? I think this is an interesting question. It sort of naturally comes up in this topic, so I felt like we should address that. Now, if you all remember my iron hourglass, if you will, the iron triangle is the one of illustrating the problem of suffering, which is the one on the top, but also the problem of evil. Those are 2 different things. And then the bottom one, are we free? The problem of human freedom, that bottom part of the triangle. And we focused a lot on God's omniscience because it's in the middle. So we initially attacked that part. What does that mean? And can we get an understanding of the nature of God's omniscience? So now we're going to try and tackle this bottom one a little bit. We did it somewhat last week. All right, so here's our iron triangle of freedom. You have God's omniscience at the top. Then you have God accomplishing his purposes on the bottom, and then human freedom in the bottom right corner. As you may realize as you look through this a bit, there's some tension in a few places. Now, there's no tension between God's omniscience and God accomplishing his purposes. That's really not any kind of problem. However, on the other 2 legs, there is a little bit. First one on God's omniscience and human freedom. Can foreknown actions actually be free? If you think about it, this can be a little difficult. We went over this in the first class, actually. So if you think about, did God know when God created that Adam and Eve would sin? Did Adam and Eve sin of their own free will? Can God know? So usually people say yes and yes to those. Then another one, can God know a falsehood? And usually people say no to that. And you say, all right, well, here's the problem. If God knew before Adam and Eve were created that they were going to sin and God cannot know a falsehood, then could there be could they do anything else? It seems like their action is determined, so could it actually be free? Augustine formulated the problem that way. So there's your first problem. Can a foreknown action be free? The second one is God accomplishing his purposes and humans having free will. And the question of how can these 2 things coexist? Because at some point, these are, as we established in the Divine Decree class, we believe that we have freedom. We also believe that God has freedom. We also know that our intents and purposes don't always align with God's. So there are collisions there. So what happens at the collision of human freedom and God's freedom, and God's will and the human will? And so when you look at this, since there's no problem here between God's omniscience and God accomplishing his purposes, but there's 2 problems here between the bottom 2 and then the right 2, the problem appears to be centered right there on humans having free will. What does that mean? How do we understand this? We had this with the iron hourglass omniscience in the middle. We said, all right, we're going to tackle this one because this kind of seems like it's at the crux of the issue. On this triangle, you're stuck on that human freedom one. This is one that seems to be causing problems for the triangle. It isn't actually necessarily a full iron triangle. The different views that we've talked about have different ways of solving this. And the first one is the divine decree view just says, I'm going to take the left two because you're right. The rightward two actually have some problems. Or I'm going to take the left two because the bottom right, human free will, it does have those problems. We know the simple foreknowledge view. Remember, this view is God created a universe with human creatures that have libertarian free will. And because of God's perspective outside time, at the moment of creation, there's what's called the noetic Big Bang, the knowledge, that's what Jack Cottrell called it. Sort of God instantly knows everything, all future events exhaustively, just by nature of God's perspective. But God is observing free actions. God isn't influencing those free actions. Simple foreknowledge, I got to tell you, has some issues too. Does God foreknow God's own actions? But how is that the case? Because God's choice to act is logically after God's understanding of all things that would be. And then, so you can see the tension that creates with God accomplishing his purposes. If God's omniscience is simply because of God's perspective and God created free creatures, is God just getting lucky? Oh, whew, I won. Thank goodness. That was uncertain. So again, as you may have realized throughout this whole thing, I don't believe simple foreknowledge is a stable position, but it is in fact something that's out there. The openness position takes the bottom two. And says, God accomplishes his purposes, humans have free will, humans are given libertarian freedom, and they act on that libertarian freedom. God is so intelligent that God knows all logical possibilities, or all possible actions that free creatures could take, and can assign probabilities to that, and so knows the most likely outcomes, but doesn't actually know exhaustively, definitely, what will happen in the future. So this idea of omniscience, that's the one that openness pulls back from. It says God's all intelligence and all competence allows God to still accomplish his purposes, even in a world where humans have free will, sort of like Garry Kasparov will always defeat my daughter at chess, or me for that matter. So that's the way that the openness one decides to solve the problem. It redefines omniscience to create no problem between the compatibility of God accomplishing his purposes and human freedom, and says, can foreknown actions be free? They say no, and therefore redefine omniscience. Molinists, of course, as we've talked about, believe they have the triangle solved by saying God knows all possibilities that are consistent with human freedom. You be the judge on that one, and if you want to go back, you can look at the Molinism episode to learn more about that. But like we said, the problem seems to be centered down there. And if you want to anchor in that humans have free will, then you have to deal with these tensions somehow. And you saw how the openness position, for instance, answered it by redefining omniscience. And the divine decree view will actually do something similar, sort of define free will differently. So I want to get into that and explain these different ideas of human freedom. So here's the question for today. Our warm-up questions, it took a little bit to get here. So here's the question. How would we define freedom? So the scenario is someone is free if, in any situation, the person is fully capable of choosing whatever they want to do, and the person's wants, so again, they're free to choose whatever they want to do, the person's wants are not determined by any previous inclinations, desires, or prejudices. So that's one option. That's option A. Option B is they're capable of choosing whatever they want to do, regardless of whether or not the person's wants are determined by inclinations, desires, or prejudices. So in option A, you are free to choose action A or action not A, and there's nothing that's going to push you in one direction or the other. It's truly a spontaneous reaction. And then in the second one, it is based on sort of the inclinations and desires of the individual, which may or may not be externally determined. So if you choose the first one, this is known as libertarian freedom. This is typically what's thought of when we speak of the word human freedom. We are free to make whatever choices that we want to make. This is the view that's held by simple foreknowledge, by openness, and by Molinism. They assume libertarian freedom. The bottom one, and less common, is known as compatibilistic freedom. It's called compatibilistic because it is compatible with other determining factors, like, for instance, God's decree. So this is held by the divine decree view. So I want to go into a little bit of these different models. And in particular, I'm going to spend some time on the compatibilistic one, because the libertarian one, I think, comes pretty naturally to people. I think we know what it means, and it doesn't require an extensive explanation. So we'll be spending much more time talking about compatibilism and seeing that through scripture and through some philosophical argumentation as well. One thing, too, to go back to last week's, and if you haven't seen last week's, then this chart is not going to make much sense to you. But this chart here goes over those four models of grace and the interactions between God's grace and the human will. And so the top three, Pelagianism, semi-Pelagianism, Arminianism, those are libertarian freedom models. The Calvinist or the Augustinian model, that one is a compatibilistic model. So you can see in all of those circumstances, what you're dealing with is human decisions, like where's the placement of the human decision relative to the security of salvation. So if the human decision is coming prior to the security of salvation, you're in a libertarian model. If the human decision is coming after the security of salvation, you're in a compatibilistic model. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm trying to bring all these frameworks in. We've talked about those four views, Molinism, simple foreknowledge, divine decree, openness. We've talked about these different models of the interaction of grace and free will, the Pelagian models, Arminianism, Calvinism, Augustinianism. I'm imposing the libertarian compatibilist. We're learning a lot of vocabulary. Hopefully you can see how this is trying to build on each other, and that we're able to have a conversation now that's at a very high level by going through all of these different ways of thinking. All right, so we're going to start in with libertarian freedom. And like I said, I think we're going to go over this one a little bit more quickly because it comes more naturally. I want to look at the biblical arguments for the libertarian position. Again, the libertarian position being that humans are fully able to choose either to follow God or not to follow God of their own volition. So, going back to this model here, you can see where human decision comes in and how that lends itself to libertarianism. So the human decisions in Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism are the first thing that happen. They require essentially the neutral will, that the will as it is can either choose to follow God or not to follow God. In Arminianism, libertarian free will is created by prevenient grace. So yes, we are originally sinful, but because of prevenient grace, we now have the capacity to choose. In either of those cases, you have a will that is able to autonomously choose one or the other, A or not A or B. So biblical arguments for this is going to be starting with ought implies can. The verses that describe what we ought to do imply that we can do it. So this is very much like the arguments made by the semi-Pelagians and to some extent the Arminians. The next thing is that you're going to see sometimes God expressing surprise. So credit to open theism for this one. But again, the idea, if God expresses surprise, then it sort of implies that we're not having to work around some kind of determined plan, that we truly have the ability to choose one thing or another, and God may in fact be surprised by that. So one of the first verses I'll go into in support of those ideas, Deuteronomy chapter 30. So the wandering in the desert is finally over. They're about to enter the promised land for real. And this is sort of the final speech at the end of the covenant rededication ceremony, before the death of Moses, before Joshua takes over, before they go into the promised land. Moses is now giving them his speech. And at the end of the sort of rededication of the covenant, he then says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life. We know this one. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this choose life. I've laid before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life. That ought, that imperative in this conception implies that we can do that. It implies that we can either choose life or death. We can either choose blessing or curse, which is sort of this libertarian idea. Another one that's very often used, 1 Corinthians 10:13. So no testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. This in many translations, no temptation has come to you that is not common to humanity. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. So this is often thought of as saying that, yes, you're going to come across temptations, but God is not going to let you be tested beyond your strength. Instead, the way out will be given to you. And sort of implied in the understanding here is so that you may take it. You could see actually a compatibilist reading of this as well, or an Augustinian reading of this as well, which is that the emphasis not being on you will be provided a way out, but God is faithful, will not let you be tested beyond your strength. And so emphasizing the action of God in that by sort of the grace of God's action, you will be able to get through. But this one is very much relied on by libertarian freedom advocates. Another one right here, Jesus is always, depicted in medieval art or later art as a, Northern European with very nice hair. This is, Jesus knocking at the novelist's door in Revelation chapter 3. So listen, I'm standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come into you and eat with you and you with me. So the idea here, we know this image, we've seen this painting or other ones like it. Jesus basically standing at the door of your heart and knocking. And if you will but let him in, if you will open the door, then I will come in and I will eat with you. Contrast this, by the way, to the Reformed analogy, which is of Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, which didn't have a doorknob on the other side of it. But this is the way that the libertarian freedom point of view would look. And then finally on the topic of God's surprise. So Jeremiah 32:34. So this is lamenting the degradation of the Israelites and the Jews, or the Israelites and the Judahites. So saying they are setting up, this is right before the exile. They set up their abominations in the house that bears my name and defiled it. They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I did not command them, nor did it enter my mind that they should do this abomination, causing Judah to sin. So this whole idea that it didn't enter my mind, I did not command them, this seems to cut against the idea that there's some sort of superintending plan. In my opinion, this is actually one of the most powerful counter-arguments to the Reform position, because it is explicitly saying, like, I did not do this. I didn't even think about it. And so if you take those words as they're written right there, it seems to imply that things happen that are not part of the command or decree of God, and maybe not even within the conception of God, something that God's not even thinking about. So this is some of the biblical support to the libertarian position. And some other arguments for libertarianism go outside of the Bible. You'll see, first of all, our experience. We have as if free will. And what I mean by as if free will is that when we go about our lives, we perceive ourselves to be in circumstances where we can choose to do one thing or choose to do another. We are kind of aware of the fact that even after we do something, we know what the actions and the patterns within our minds and our bodies would have been if we had chosen to do something else. So we fully understand that, and we could think of and imagine ourselves doing something other than what we did. And because of that, that's the reason I call this as if free will. Like, even if we don't have as if determinism. We don't go through life sort of like spectators like we're sitting in a ride or watching a movie of our own life. We are active participants. And so we act as if we have free will, and we act as if everybody else is making free decisions also. In fact, the legal system is sort of predicated on this, right? If things are determined, then when's the legal system? Why are you holding anybody accountable for anything? So our experience that we do, and it's a very powerful influence on our thinking, that we are choosing, lends us towards this understanding. The other one I'm going to call the argument from evil. And this is an argument for human libertarian freedom from the fact that evil exists. And it goes like this. The reason evil exists in our world is because we, fallen human creatures, have free will, and therefore we sometimes choose evil. God can't be responsible for this evil because of God's holy character. God is sinless. God is all-loving. God cannot be the author of sin. You'll hear that word. So this is seen as a defense of God's character, that because God cannot be responsible for the evil, the mechanism by which the evil comes into the world is through human decisions, is through our own freedom. If God is determining our decisions in some way, then God is the author of sin, but God can't do that. So therefore, it must be a libertarian sort of freedom. That's kind of philosophically, or not necessarily philosophically. It's theologically how we get there. We start with an understanding of who God is, and then we look at the evil in the world that's perpetrated by human beings and say that our God can't have decided to make that happen. And then we sort of deductively get down to free will. So that's the understanding of libertarian freedom. I now want to get into the idea of compatibilistic freedom. So this is likely not as familiar to you. There's a distinction. I've made this distinction before in the class, and I want to go into it in a little bit more depth right now, between the concept of free choice and the concept of free will. These are two different things. So free choice is the ability to choose based on your desires. I would like a drink. I'm somewhat thirsty. There we go. I chose to take a drink. But why was I thirsty? Well, you could say there's these biological processes. There's these things that underlie, that sort of create that desire within you. And that's exactly right. And you would say, like, I am free to choose to quench my thirst or to act on that, but am I really free to feel thirsty? Say, well, no, thirst is something that kind of emerges. It inflicts itself upon me, and that influences my decision to take a drink at some point, or if somebody offers me water, to take that, to drink as much water as I do, versus the next person. So free will is the ability to choose anything regardless of desires. It's sort of the free will would be divorced from any sorts of those desires. Free will is like what God has. God can truly choose to do anything. We are, though, bound by our nature and our desires in this model. So if we can choose based on what we desire, then we have free choice. But can we desire what to desire? That would be free will. So compatibilism says that free choice operates on the options presented to it by the not so necessarily free will. I'll go into a few other examples of this. But, why do some people drive in the left lane or the middle lane or the right lane? We have preferences. Chocolate or vanilla, Coke or Pepsi. How much Coke or Pepsi depends on how thirsty you are. Well, where does that thirst come from? Well, you're not deciding how thirsty you are. The thirst is something that's emergent. Take that away from a physical process and say, like, how loud are you going to blast the music? Well, maybe in one instance, it depends upon how angry you are. How angry are you? Are you deciding how angry to be? No, you're reacting to that feeling you didn't cause. I mean, if we were really masters of our own feelings and really masters of our own desires, we would all be happy all the time. And we could, Book of Mormon style, turn it off like a light switch, just go click. If there are desires that we wanted to go away, then we could turn others on. But we're not. Like, those things are dealt to us. And, a few very kind of famous philosophers have reflected well on this. Arthur Schopenhauer puts it very clearly. A man can surely do what he wills to do. That's free choice, but cannot determine what he wills. That's free will. So we are free to act on what it is that we desire, but we don't choose that which we desire. And this is going to ultimately become, when you put a theological lens on it, you say the things that we desire come from the broken, sinful human spirit that we are given. That is the heart of stone that can be changed into the heart of flesh. This is why it's consistent with the Augustinian Calvinistic model. So another one would come from a lecture I heard by Jordan Peterson, and I had to, Jordan Peterson, if you're not familiar with him, the New York Times called him in the late 2010s the most influential public intellectual in the world at the time. And during one of his lectures, of which you'll find many, 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 like thousands of hours of him talking online, he said, we're not exactly masters in our own houses. It's such an interesting thing to note, because if we're not masters, is it chaos or is it our nature? What are we beholden to that we cannot escape from? And then he told the audience, like, try controlling yourself. Try acting as if you are the fundamental source of your own values, independent of any sort of transcendent ethical structure. See if you can do that. Try it for a month. I've never seen anyone who could do it, not even for a moment. And I want to hone in here on this part, like, try acting as if you are the fundamental source of your own values. That's libertarianism right there. That's the idea, like, we are the wellspring from which our desires come, independent of any sort of transcendent structure. See if you can pull that off. Peterson has some really insightful thoughts on how there is no way that you can operate without a structure of value. Anywhere we choose to even look implies value. Right now, I'm looking at the camera. I'm looking at the camera because I'm recording a video. And this camera now, at this particular moment, has a lot of value for the activity that I'm doing. That's why my gaze is fixed right there. The moment I hit stop record, this camera is going to stop having that value. I'm probably going to flip down this little thing right here, so you can't see me anymore. So where we look, how we act, presumes a value structure that's being imposed on things. Where does that value structure come from? So, but the part here that really resonated with me is that very beginning. We're not exactly masters in our own houses, and he talks much more about that using quotes from Nietzsche and Jung. Paul Helm, then, from a more theological perspective, this is in that book that I described in class number 1, Divine Foreknowledge, 4 Views. He's talking about the difference between compatibilism and libertarianism. He called it incompatibilist freedom. I have redacted that to libertarian freedom to be consistent with the language I chose. But basic to the difference of view between those who think that divine omniscience is consistent with libertarian freedom and those who think it is not a principally different understanding of the nature of God or of human freedom, nor even a difference of interpretation of this or that passage, but a, quote, profoundly different appreciation of the plight of humankind and the power of God. So this goes back to the free choice, free will, to last week, the freedom or the bondage of the will. Compatibilist freedom is going to have a very strong view of the bondage of the will, very much like Martin Luther or Calvin or Augustine. So the libertarian holds that because the plight, I love this line, the libertarian holds that because the plight of humans is not so great, for they retain inalienable freedom to choose for or against Christ, the power of God need not be so great either. We'll read that one more time. The libertarian holds that because the plight of humans is not so great, for they retain inalienable freedom to choose for or against Christ. This is libertarianism. This is the idea that you are free to choose one way or the other. If you go back to that Pelagian, semi-Pelagian, Arminian, Calvinist 4 views, it's the top 3. You have the ability to choose for or against Christ. The power of God need not be so great either. The Augustinian account of the plight of humankind is that such people cannot want God, and his grace is needed not only to help them to want him, but also to ensure that they do so. So that's really the point of view of the compatibilistic position. It starts with this understanding that humans aren't libertarianly free. We have a bound will. And maybe the best way that's ever been described is by Jonathan Edwards in his treatise, Freedom of the Will. So in part 4, he has this analogy. And the first one is, I'll say what I think libertarian freedom thinks of compatibilism. And the second prong of it is what compatibilists actually believe. So consider 2 cases, he says, in which a man has offended his king, is thrown into prison, and is later faced with an offer of freedom. So 2 cases, each has a man who's done something that's gotten him in prison, but then that man is given an offer for freedom by the king. King comes out to the prison and calls to the first prisoner with an offer. So this is scenario number 1. If the prisoner will come out from his cell, kneel and humbly beg the king's pardon, he will be forgiven and set free and also be greatly enriched and advanced to honor. The prisoner heartily repents of the folly and wickedness of his offense against the monarch, is thoroughly disposed to come out, bow down and accept the king's offer, but he can't because he is still locked in, confined by strong walls with gates of brass and bars of iron. This is what libertarian freedom advocates think of Calvinism. They think that you assume at the beginning that humans have a neutral will, and then say God's predestination is imposed on that neutral will to incline some people towards choosing God and others towards not choosing God. And so it's, some people are chosen in one direction, some people are chosen in a different direction, but if they had been left alone, they may have chosen differently. Some people, maybe this is the best way to put it, if God had not predestined some to damnation, some of those people may have come to repent, like this prisoner here who wants to accept the king's offer but is stopped with the gates and bars. So that's one perspective. So this is this person truly is bound, and this is my commentary. This is what the libertarian freedom advocates think of the Calvinist or Augustinian model. Here's Edward's second scenario. The king comes to the prison and has the second prisoner's chains knocked off and the cell door open and makes the same offer that was made to the prisoner in case A. But this prisoner has a haughty, ungrateful, willful disposition. And when the compassionate king makes his offer, the prisoner is so stiff and proud and full of haughty malignity that he cannot be willing to accept the offer. His ingrained strong pride and malice have complete power over him, and as it were bind him by binding his heart. The opposition of his heart has mastery over him, having a much stronger influence on his mind than all the king's kind offers and promises. This is what the Calvinist Augustinian model actually believes. It's not that God is forcing somebody to not choose him. It's that people by nature are like this prisoner, so proud, so defiant, so hate their king, so hate God. They're fundamentally enemies of God, that they won't take the offer even when it is given to them. And so what you have now isn't a neutral will. You have a bound will. You do not have the freedom of the will. You have the of Erasmus. You have the bondage of the will of Luther. And so then the question of, are we free to choose? Well, yes, we're free to choose. We have free choice. But is the will free? The will is not free. And so the will choice operates on the desires presented to it by the will. And that results in the series of decisions that represent the no one who does good, not even one, for all have fallen short of the glory of God and sin. So that's hopefully a good backdrop here. It brings us back to the quote from Jeremiah: "Can an Ethiopian change his skin or leopard change its spots? Then neither can you do good who are accustomed to doing evil." These are our spots. This is our skin. This is who humans are, unless the heart of stone is taken out and turned into a heart of flesh by God himself. That's the compatibilistic, Augustinian, Calvinistic model. Okay, so I want to get into the biblical arguments for compatibilism. I've talked a lot about the theological or philosophical up to this point, but I think there's a lot to commend from the Bible on this. And here's where it comes in. There are multiple instances where in one action you see two intentions. God having a holy and righteous intention, word chosen importantly, meaning that God is using this act in some way. God intends this act. And humans having a different intention, a sinful intention. So God is decreeing that the action take place, and yet it is freely chosen. Hence compatibilism. So the most iconic examples, God's use of Assyria is described in Isaiah chapter 10. That's the one that we're going to focus on mainly, but also the story of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis 37 through 50, and then the crucifixion of Jesus described by Peter in Acts 4. We've talked about those two examples before. I'm going to focus mainly here on Isaiah chapter 10, but I want to give some background because Isaiah chapter 10 comes in a historical context, and I think we need some of that to understand where this is coming from. So the United Kingdom, the kingdom of Saul, the kingdom of David, the kingdom of Solomon, after the death of Solomon, is divided into the northern kingdom of Israel, which is the 11 tribes not named Judah, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. Capital of Israel is Samaria, capital of Judah is Jerusalem. In the 700s, Ahaz becomes the king of Judah. And as he ascends to the throne, he's immediately met with a question. The Assyrians, represented in the yellow right here, and just on the edge there is Damascus. The Assyrians are planning to attack the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel and Syria are asking for Judah's help to attack Assyria. So Israel plus Syria want Judah to join them to fight Assyria to prevent this invasion and to help them survive. Ahaz refuses. And so, being the nice guys that they are, the northern kingdom of Israel and the Syrians decide to attack Judah. So, in order to survive this, Ahaz goes to Assyria. And Ahaz asks for protection against the northern kingdom of Israel and the Syrian armies. In order to give tribute to encourage Assyria to join them, the temple, Ahaz goes to the temple treasure, plunders it, and gives that to Assyria and makes offering to the Assyrian gods. This is in clear violation of the covenant. Assyria, flattered by the tribute, complies, sacks Damascus of the Syrians, sacks Samaria, and then makes Jerusalem its vassal state, oppresses them with taxation and violence. So Judah trusted the Assyrians instead of trusting God to preserve them, violated the covenant, and now Judah's friend has become their enemy. And it's against this historical backdrop that you read the Assyrian woe oracle in Isaiah chapter 10. So it goes like this: "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my wrath. I will send him against a godless nation." Okay? This is spoken by the prophet Isaiah, and the oracles are a speech from God related through the prophet. Woe to Assyria. So Assyria is getting some bad news, is what this is saying. Woe, so bad news to you, Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in their hands is my wrath. So, woe to you, the agent of my anger and my wrath, against the godless nation that is Judah. They are the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands belongs to me. Yahweh. Yahweh is the speaker here. I will send him against the godless nation. So Assyria is the rod of God's anger, the staff of his wrath. Assyria, the rod of his anger, the staff of his wrath, is being sent against the godless nation, Judah. But woe to them, bad news to you who are my vessels. Hold on here. I will command him to go against a people destined for my rage. Again, this is parallelism. So I will send him against a godless nation. I will command him to go against a people destined for my rage, to take spoils, plunder, and trample them down like clay in the streets. So God is announcing a woe upon Assyria. Assyria, who is carrying out his plan. Okay? This needs to sink in. The woe oracle is for Syria, for Assyria. Assyria is also the rod of his anger. The staff in his hands is his wrath. God is using Assyria against the godless nation. This is Judah pursuant to the covenant curses for its sin. They are to be delivered into enemy hands if they violate the covenant. The high places will be destroyed, as we saw that there were high places. They will be scattered amongst the nations. This ultimately brings about exile. However, and here's a question, was it God's intention to eliminate Israel and Judah? No, of course not, right? The covenant with Abraham, that through you the blessing will be brought to the whole world. The covenant with David, that your son will sit on the throne forever. This punishment was covenant discipline, not annihilation. Not like the destruction of Judah and Israel was not the point of this, okay? That's important because, just to prove that point, I suppose. A little bit further in the chapter, on the day the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on the one who struck them, but will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel in truth. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. So this here is basically saying, until you learn to trust in me instead of trust in the Assyrians, things will be bad, but eventually a remnant will return. So this is consistent with the covenant prescription for restoration. Leviticus 26, I use that one because I'm more familiar with that than Deuteronomy 28. But if they confess their iniquity and that of their ancestors, if their hearts are humble and they make amends for their iniquity, I will remember the covenant with Jacob. I will remember the covenant with Isaac and with Abraham. I will remember the land. They will be brought back, essentially. So God does not intend to destroy them with Assyria, but to use Assyria as punishment and discipline per the covenant curses. God is reassuring his people that the punishment will abate. So that's happening here. The Assyrians, however, all of this was to establish God's intention is not to destroy them. God's intention is to bring about the covenant discipline for covenant disobedience. Okay? The Assyrians, however, this is not what he intends, nor does he have that in mind. The intent of his heart, it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. For he says, by the strength of my hand, says the king of Assyria, I have done it by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I have removed the boundaries of the peoples and have plundered their treasures. Like a bull, I have brought down those who sat on their thrones. So look here. Before, at the beginning of the woe oracle, God was saying, woe to you, Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in your hands is my indignation. I will bring you. But that's not his intention. His is to destroy. For he says, I have done it. My hand, my wisdom, my understanding. I removed it. I brought down those who sat on thrones. So you have two intentions here. God's intention to bring discipline on Israel, but to ultimately restore them. Assyria's intention to plunder and destroy. And what's God's response to this intention of Assyria, the one that we just outlined? When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the arrogant boasting of the king of Assyria and his haughty pride. Shall the axe vaunt itself over the one who wields it, or the saw magnify itself over the one who handles it? As if a rod should raise up the one who lifts it up, or as if a staff should lift the one who is not wood. Therefore the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, will send wasting sickness among his stout warriors, that is, the king of Assyria. And under his glory a burning will be kindled like a burning of fire. And therefore, says the Lord, the God of hosts, O my people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they beat you with the rod and lift up their staff against you as the Egyptians did. For in a very little while my indignation will come to an end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. The Lord of hosts will wield a whip against them as when he struck Midian at the rock of Oreb. His staff will be over the sea, and he will lift it as he did in Egypt. On that day his burden will be removed from your shoulder, and his yoke will be destroyed from your neck. Okay. Let's go back for a sec, because I love the sarcasm here. So the king of Assyria is going to be punished for the arrogant boasting, or for his arrogant boasting, his haughty pride. And here God's like, shall the axe vaunt itself over the one who wields it? The saw magnify itself over the one who handles it. Remember, woe to you, Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in which is my indignation. Will the rod of my anger vaunt itself over me? Will the staff, a staff should lift the one who is not wood. God is very upset with the disposition of the Assyrian king's heart. Now, did the Assyrians carry out what God intended? Yes. Assyria is the rod of his anger, the staff of his wrath, commanded against the people destined for his rage. Could they have done anything else? Could the Assyrians have resisted? Seems like the answer is no. God's saying he's deliberately bringing Assyria against Israel. Answering yes means that God's unable to accomplish his purposes without their cooperation. That's not what the text says. Did God punish Assyria? Yes, God punished Assyria. So the Assyrians did what God intended. They couldn't have done anything else. But God punished them for that. Is that fair? Well, why was Assyria punished? For harming Israel? No. They were punished for the arrogant boasting and the haughty pride of the Assyrians. That's why they were punished. So you have one action and two intentions. You have God's holy and just purpose, the discipline of Judah according to the covenant. You have Assyria's sinful, unrighteous purpose to destroy, and that's because of their pride. God does not coerce the Assyrians into doing anything. God doesn't need to. Assyria is acting completely in accordance with their desires. And yet, God has an intention in allowing these desires to come out. What is that intention? As we've described above. To be honest, isn't God restraining Assyria from committing further evil? After all, they want to destroy, they want to plunder, but that's not God's intention, so they won't do it. So if anything, the control is not on, somebody needs to go sack Jerusalem. The Assyrians seem like they're pretty nice guys, but I'm going to make them evil, and I'm going to go make them attack. That's not what's happening. The king of Assyria and his haughty pride and his arrogance, it just needs to be let out a little bit, but not as much as it wants to be. This is the compatibilistic model. This is Assyria acting on their desires. So they have free choice. They do not have free will because, their desires are orchestrated in such a way, I suppose, so that God can carry out this particular action in history. But they are truly acting with free choice. The fact that God allows these desires to be expressed to result in a particular action does not absolve them of the sinfulness of their hearts. For this they are held accountable, not for the effect, but for their sinful attitudes. This is just like what you see in Genesis 50:20, Joseph speaking to his brothers. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant this for good in order to bring about the present result to preserve many people alive. So there is one action there, the selling of Joseph into slavery, with two intentions on the part of the brothers to toss him out, on the part of God to put Joseph in this particular situation in order to preserve many people alive. So, and I want to say one other word on the argument from evil. So remember, the argument from evil, one of the ones in favor of libertarian free will, is that libertarian free will defends the character of God from being responsible for evil. The compatibilists would say that the libertarian model does the exact opposite. That the libertarian model is actually the one that impugns the character of God. whereas the compatibilistic model preserves the character of God. Here's how the argument goes. In compatibilism, all actions that we see as evil have a purpose. There is, even if it's accompanied with an evil secondary intention of humans, the humans can be evil, indeed, using their free choice on their sinful desires to do evil. But there is a purpose in God letting that evil out, whatever it happens to be. We don't always know. We actually very seldom know. But there is no such thing as purposeless evil in a compatibilistic world. On the libertarian side, God knew the evil would happen. God was powerful enough to stop it. God did not stop it. And since it was a free human action, God has no purpose in it. It's just what a libertarian actor did. So God infallibly knew that the evil was going to take place. God had no purpose in it. It's just a free choice. God could have stopped it. God didn't stop it. God did not lack knowledge. God did not lack power. And God didn't stop it even though he knew exactly what was going to happen. And it's completely purposeless because there's no free choice. It's a libertarianly free action. So in that case, you have a God who just allows for purposeless evil for whatever reason. I don't really know. Whereas on compatibilism, you have a purpose behind it. Even if we don't know what that purpose is, the purpose exists. And so which one has a God that has a higher character? The God who has a holy and just purpose in the allowing of every evil action that God allows, and restraining all the others that we don't even know about, or the one who just kind of sits back and lets us, mess with whatever that we want to, sort of like the cartoon in the opening slide, where you've got the angel looking to God and say, "Hey, don't look at me. I was against free will." Which one actually has a holier God? I tend to think that the libertarian one is negligent. Interestingly enough, open theism can escape this problem because it denies God's omniscience. It denies the very first premise. God knew the evil would happen. The open theist could say, God knew the probability of it happening, but God didn't necessarily know that was going to happen, and God is surprised sometimes, and God takes risks, and sometimes God doesn't get it right. By denying God's omniscience, you can opt out of this problem. Simple foreknowledge and Molinism can't get out of this problem. So, in summary, human freedom is generally understood in either a libertarian or compatibilistic sense. Both views acknowledge free choice. The question is whether or not the human will is neutral, able to choose good or evil, or if it is broken and bound to sin. If you take the first route, then you have the libertarian model. If you say it is broken and bound to sin, then you have the compatibilistic model. Both views have to account for how humans can have free choice and God accomplishing his purposes. So again, this is where that the bondage of the will melds into compatibilism. God accomplishes his purposes through his decree, and yet does not need to violate free choice. It's not determinism. God is able to regenerate the will. God operates on the will, and humans operate on choice. That's the compatibilistic model. The libertarian model is humans operate on the will and choice. So hopefully that makes sense. Two views seem capable of pulling this off. Open theism on the libertarian side and the divine decree view. Those two seem to be able to find a way to handle the tension of God accomplishing his purposes with human freedom. Simple foreknowledge and Molinism seem to have trouble on the theological front in the argument from evil. So at least, the open theistic and the divine decree can pull that off. Open theism has God masterfully reacting to free human decisions, whereas the divine decree has God choosing the influences that guide human desires. So anyway, that's all for now on the nature of libertarian freedom versus compatibilistic freedom. I think my editorial slant was pretty clear in this one that you may have walked in thinking, that we knew what human freedom meant. But I want you to think about that Jordan Peterson quote, that we are not masters in our own house. Where do your desires come from? What are you really acting on? When we pray, create in me a clean heart, O God, Psalm 51. Change my heart, O God, make me ever true. Change my heart, O God, help me be like you. And that we are to be conformed to the image of Christ. It's not because we have a neutral will that is already able to do all those things. It's because we recognize our brokenness. And that will, as Luther pointed out last week, is either bound to God or it's bound to sin. And may we pray that we can have our will conformed to the image of our Creator. In Jesus' name, amen.